FPS games have been around for quite a while. They have become some of the most popular kinds of games today. But like what Doom did with paving the road for retro FPS games, Quake brought it into the 3D world with a shiny new engine and a solid game to boot, and I think it's the best shooter it has made. Okay, the title was a bit clickbaity. Quake is the best classic id shooter, and it was never intended to be one in the first place. Id wanted to break away from their well-known FPS formula, using a new truly 3D engine to create an RPG. Despite that, Quake came out the way it did today. I won't go too much into the history of Quake, but if you are intrigued, Ahoy did an outstanding video on the game. Prompt card on the top right, or video link in the description. So what makes Quake the best of the classic 8 games? Among other things, robust gameplay and impeccable atmosphere are the two that spring to mind. They are the backbone of Quake. I am not the most fond of retro FPS games, however it can't be denied that these shooters have been renowned for their solid gameplay. I believe that Quake's bare-bones approach to it is by far the purest and most engaging of the bunch. What makes the minimal approach to combat work? Well, it comes down to having good gameplay feel and a tightly focused combat loop. It's fast, frantic, and ferocious. Quake was a game that made use of Mouselook in tangent to the keyboard, whereas older FPS games for the most part were keyboard only. While it may not be the first game to use Mouselook, it is an integral part to the gameplay and navigation of Quake, and it's all the better for it. We take Mouselook and keyboard for granted today, but nevertheless it cannot be understated how good it feels. This isn't something exclusive to Quake. Other classic FPS titles have retroactively had Mouselook added to them through modern source ports and the such, but they don't feel nearly as good as a truly 3D space. Space that's in need of good movement. A core pillar to any retro FPS game is movement, and it is present and accounted for. It feels precise, deliberate, and with purpose. An issue with older FPS titles is that they were never built with Mouselook in mind. This leads to awkward situations where your camera bumps when adjusting to the terrain. I've had less frustrations in Quake, especially in segments that may need finer control to traverse. Your movement is just as much of a factor into your gameplay as is your aim. It makes Quake feel much nicer to play. It makes things fluid, strafing around, dodging attacks while also retaliating with your own. It's even better when you add bunny hopping into the fray of things. I'm not excellent at it myself. In fact, I don't believe I'm benefiting from doing it, mostly because getting it to work is more finicky than what I'm used to. But even the mere act of doing it makes my gameplay feel much better. You're not grounded and running at a fixed pace, rather you are gracefully leaping around and soaring past grenades and bullets. A great movement system is only part of Quake's brilliance. You need guns that go boom, monsters that roar, soundscapes that unnerve. The sound design of a game is an essential part, and in the case of Quake, it's pretty stellar. Gloom consumes the player, transporting them into a state of dread. The industrial ambience is very understated, however it's the subtleness that makes it really shine. It's minimal but executed wonderfully. The ambience is the glue that ties the action together. The weapons sound punchy and impactful, further adding to a satisfying gameplay feel. It's an orchestra of gunfire as weapons boom, fiends yelp in pain, hideous ogres brandish their chainsaws, all while your character makes that pathetic jumping sound. Quake's sound design is wonderful. So wonderful you could play the game with sound only. The lack of music only adds to the gothic atmosphere of the game, and that's how id initially planned to ship the game. But when you get an opportunity for Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails to soundtrack your game, well, that's an offer you simply cannot refuse. For being so subtle, the music of Quake makes a solid impact from the iconic main menu to the ambience of levels. Trent Reznor and his band wonderfully capture a mood that soundtracks your violence. It suits the medieval gothic gloom. The music exists to set the tone for each level, and some tracks are even comprised mostly of noise. It's noise that maintains itself and eerily lingers in the downtime, when you are traversing from your previous battle to the next. The composition of the soundtrack allows for the game to be at the forefront, but not to the point of being unnoticeable. It's the cherry on top of this layered cake of misery and mayhem. That misery and mayhem is sewn into Quake's aesthetic design. Much like previous id titles, it's a mashup of aliens, Satan, and space. The foundation for the game that was mixed with other elements to create an industrial gothic medieval setting. It's quite the hodgepodge of themes, but it's all the better for it. It's an identity of its own, one that few games can evoke well, and when they do, it can be tied back to Quake. The muted colors just work as a tone setter. It reflects the rust and grime that covers Quake's levels, but it's balanced out by being varied. Each level has its own set of colors to reflect those areas, giving every level a distinct cue as to what you may expect. This really is just the result of unifying a mix of different elements to combine them into one strong aesthetic. Now that we've gone over all the elements that make Quake look and feel good, let's get down to the nitty-gritty shooty stuff, also known as the combat of the game, because after all that's where all the fun is, right? The focus on minimalism is also seen in its weapon and enemy roster. The weapons are broken down into 3 types: hit scan, projectile, and tracking, with each weapon having 2 sub-tiers. The first sub-tier being basic variations of weapons like the starting shotgun, nail gun, and grenade launcher. The other tier is the super tier, hosting weapons such as the super shotgun, super nail gun, and rocket launcher. The differences between the two are simple. Basic weapons provide better ammo conservation at the cost of weaker damage output. The super tier provides much more power at a faster output, but at the cost of using more ammo. In classic id fashion, the super shotgun is your workhorse, the weapon you'll be using most often. It's a powerful package at a close range, however it has a hungry appetite, and poor ammo management can leave you low on shotgun shells. It also lacks range. This is where the basic shotgun shines, picking off foes at a distance and finishing off weakened enemies. The nail gun has a steady flow of damage and ammo output, but if you're in need of much more damage at a moment's notice, its big brother has you sorted. The grenade launcher outputs fast explosive damage and allows for the player to dish out damage from the safety of a corner. However, it lacks range and has an arc to it. This is where the rocket launcher shines, having the superior range and damage, but has a slower output of that damage. To round things off, the power weapon of the game is the Thunderbolt. It's a sort of hit-scan tracking hybrid that provides the most damage at the fastest rate, and needs very little effort to use effectively. But ammo for it is scarce, and it chews through that supply, so it's used only for the direst of needs. Oh, there's also the axe. The flow of combat revolves around using the right tool for the right enemy, And the interesting part of it is using that focused roster of weaponry to its full effect, and seeing how each of the weapons play off of each other. A good player combos their weapons, outputting good amounts of damage while effectively managing their ammo, all while strafing around to avoid as much damage as they can. You are no longer slugging around a huge arsenal of guns trying to figure out which one you need for which enemy. All of the essentials are there, and it's up to you to make them do carnage. And who better to cause carnage to than an array of vicious foes? Quake's roster of enemies is just as condensed as everything else, focusing on the essentials of a solid composition. With retro-style FPS games, combat can be compared to chess, with all the enemies being different pieces, all with their strengths and weaknesses. Quake is very much like chess. There's the basic cannon fodder in different variations that can all be easily disposed of, but can also be that nail in the coffin that leads to your death if not kept in check. Alongside that cannon fodder, we have zombies, enemies that can only be taken down with explosives. They are generally weak, but are a nuisance, often blocking paths and such. Then you have tanky foes, ogres, fiends, and death knights. They are dangerous up close, so best keep your distance. Scrags behave as aerial support for your enemies. They are tougher to defeat with explosive weapons, such as the grenade launcher, so the best method is good tracking with a nail gun. Then you have the shamblers, huge blokes that behave as your mini-boss. They are a skill check, testing all of your knowledge into one intense combat scenario. The enemy roster is great stuff indeed. That's about all the great stuff I had to say about the game. Like with anything in life, it has downsides, and I like to point out the downsides of Quake to balance things out. Most classic FPS games are an endurance test, and they wear out pretty thin after a while. You reach a point where you've seen all the game has to offer and get tired with it. Quake has that feeling. Around the time I reach episode 3, I'm tired with the game, and by episode 4, that's where I end my playthrough. You may have noticed I forgot to mention 2 particular enemies you encounter, and those would be the 𝗂𝙂 and the spawn. I don't consider them part of the core roster, and they aren't exactly fun to fight. 𝗂𝙂s have a projectile attack that tracks you, and there is nearly no way to skillfully avoid them. They tend to dull combat, as the best strategy to fight them is to abuse walls, and should they attack you, your best option is to book it until their attack hits a wall or something. Spawns are nothing more than a nuisance that explode in your face, and they aren't introduced until the latter episodes. Thus, I don't have much of an impression of them. They just don't quite add to an already strong roster, you know? Another thing I haven't touched on is the level design. I don't find it particularly interesting, and if anything, it hinders how wonderful the combat could be. It's just a tad bit too tight in some areas, and not in the fun kind of way. I found Quake was at its best when the levels gave you enough space to really engage with Quake's gameplay. Other than what I've mentioned, I think everything else about Quake is exceptional. So whatever happened to Quake after? Well, its sequels did further the legacy, but over time it morphed from a dark and gloomy single-player campaign to an intensive multiplayer arena. Quake itself was kind of an odd series of games. Quake 2 was supposed to be a new id project that ended up under the Quake banner because id couldn't find a suitable name for the game. Quake 3 ditched single-player entirely for its multiplayer mode, and Quake 4 was, well, Quake 4. As of writing, the most recent Quake game is Quake Champions, a game that I'm not interested in playing, but very interested in as an esport. Oh well, I shall continue to hope that id one day gives Quake a proper single-player reboot that truly lives up to the original game, though I doubt it would be anytime soon. While we may not have a true reboot of Quake, we have other games that are in the same vein as Quake, and there are 2 games I could suggest. The first is Dusk. This is the game that put its publisher New Blood on the map as the face of the new wave of retro FPS games. While I personally found Dusk a tad bit uninteresting, its inspiration cannot be denied, and the attention it's received is well deserved. If you haven't heard of it, you should consider picking it up if it interests you. The second game I can wholeheartedly recommend is Devil Daggers, a true evocation of Quake both in its style and philosophy. Devil Daggers is a bare-bones arena shooter, literally, that asks one simple question: how long can you survive? Devil Daggers is the bridge between two Quake identities, the moody gothic Quake and the arena FPS Quake. Devil Daggers' aesthetic delves harder into the gloom, often reaching points where it's unnerving. Just have a listen to the gameplay. The soundscape is crowded with all sorts of noises. It not only serves the atmosphere of the game, but has a gameplay benefit too. Sound is very important, especially when you get further into the game. Combat is also boiled down to two simple functions: a stream of daggers that relies on tracking, and a shotgun blast. Even with such a limited toolset, it is all you need to engage with the gameplay of Devil Daggers. I don't want to go too much into this game because I do plan on making a video about it at some point. However, you should definitely check this one out, especially during Halloween. And that's about it for this video. If you like what you have seen, consider leaving it a like. If you are interested in my video essays, consider subscribing. For 2021, I wish to expand my channel and hopefully have YouTube be a thing that keeps me passionate and creative. So please consider it, and I deeply appreciate it. The only thing I have to plug is my Twitter, which is on screen and in the description, so you know what I'm up to and stuff of that nature. That's all I have to say. Thank you for watching and take care.